Hi, my name is Aaron Mustard, and I'm going to pick up where Vince left off and then go in a completely different direction. Um, Vince mentioned that Clancy has had some critiques of his book, and because of the fact that this was originally published in the 70s and the most recent edition was published in 2013, he's had an opportunity to address some of those critiques. In the most recent edition, he added a chapter about Anglo-Saxon tradition of writings. He also discusses specifically that he doesn't have the time or space to address the role of women, but he did go and write another book in 2018, which I'll talk a lot more about in a minute. A couple of things that I did want to bring up, some critiques from David Corner's article in the 90s, is that Clancy just basically takes for granted that um, doesn't really take for granted exactly, but he argues that the proliferation of documents started with the king and then made its way down the social scale from 1200 to 1300. And Corner says that this is an inadequate explanation of a complex process, and he's correct. It is. Clancy doesn't really go into these different groups and the way that they thought about this proliferation of documents, the ways they thought about it, why it was happening, because basically because these documents don't exist, as in documents that would refer to how they felt about this change. They might have existed, but they don't exist now. And that is one of Clancy's biggest points about the evidentiary basis for his conclusions, is that it's based on what documents are there in order to draw these conclusions, which speaks to Corner's next critique, which is that Clancy doesn't investigate the extent to which the communication of that literate mentality from the royal court to the country, was a consequence of his policies. And as Clancy argues, what we're talking about in the Middle Ages really isn't literacy as much as it is a literate mentality, or a collection of attitudes that are in the minds or the imaginations and the assumptions of many types of people. And so Clancy doesn't really go into any of these specific groups and how they felt about it or what they thought about it, because those documents don't exist. And he's sort of talking about the broad mentality of people over the course of this 250 years. So this is relevant because he does take a minute, Clancy takes a minute to talk about how he's not talked about women. And the reasons that he gives is that it is too complex to discuss at the end of a chapter, to which I say you should just write another chapter like you did about Anglo-Saxon literacy, because it requires a different approach. He also mentions that explicit references to women's literacy are rare. So again, going back to his point about the evidentiary basis, there isn't a lot of documents that refer to this. There are some about nuns, but what's more important is what happened in the houses of the aristocracy. So when we are talking about women, we're talking about upper class women, and that they would commission books of hours, and they would use those in the house to recite prayers, to read silently, to look and listen. But what's even more important is that they would read with their children, and this created literacy, or a literate mentality in children, and then it would transfer literacy to the next generation. So this is a really, really big deal, because this is sort of the basis of and the foundation of the growth of literacy in the 14th and 15th century. And this is what Clancy says. And he also mentions and ends with that this is as significant a cultural shift as the shift from memory to written record, which, if you recall, is the title of this book. So the role that women played in reading to their children at home was extremely important in developing literacy. So how did they do it? They did it by reading books of hours. Instruction in reading was primarily domestic, typically from mother to child. Some children, boy children, would receive further formal education. Girls likely would not. but that this is the basis of literacy, is reading in the home, specifically books of hours. And he says that upon these documents, or these books of hours, the future of literacy in Western culture largely rested. So that's a pretty big statement to make, about the importance of women and children in the development of literacy. And he also uses these examples in his introduction to the part two of this book, which is the literate mentality, and where he really kind of lays out the importance of literacy and how it developed in the Middle Ages, or the literate mentality. And just as two quick asides, that as Vince pointed out, the definition of the word literate doesn't have the same meaning now as it did then, and that at the core of it was that a literate person was someone who could read or understand Christian scripture. And while it became more than that, it always had that at its core. The other side note is that a Books of Hours, or Book of Hours, was a devotional book, where there were, at certain hours, certain prayers would be said in honor of the Virgin Mary, and this was set by the church. So how did women use these books of hours? Well, typically they would be in Latin with French or English captions. So women would need to read, at least know how to read, Latin, English, and French, as well as the images in the book. There's a couple of examples here, some less bawdy examples. And so there would have been sort of a visual literacy that would need to be known, or a visual reading strategy. And to them, reading implied looking at written text as well as images, and how those things interacted together. And they would have received formal instruction in homes, because they had chaplains and books and private chambers. And then what really starts to change is that women would commission books of hours more often than they had before, and that it would be something that was vividly illustrated, and sort of the equivalent of what Clancy calls the modern tabloid press. So again, he's putting a lot of emphasis on the importance of women's reading, what women needed to do, and how reading manifested in women's homes and in women's reading situations or contexts, to talk about reading in general, specifically the images. So it's really important to point out that images would have been read in context with, or in concert with, text. They were not seen as distractions or different. And this was a result of Pope Gregory's justification of images, basically that there should be images of stories from the Bible to allow illiterate people to read by seeing. And then this also transferred into books or illuminated manuscripts. So this specific image comes from a Psalter, or a book of Psalms, made for Christina of Marquiate, who was a visionary, meaning she saw visions. And because it was so rich and vivid and full of illustration, it most likely came from St. Albans, and that's where they've sort of established this, from the abbot Geoffrey, who was an entrepreneur of book production and Christina's patron. So because Christina was a visionary, and she commissioned this book, we have the Virgin Mary shown reading at the moment that she has a vision or is visited by Gabriel, who tells her she will, give birth to the Christ child. And so this is sort of an image of the Virgin Mary for a woman who also sees visions, who would sort of as an instructive way to stay focused on the text, to read, to consider, to meditate, because Christina would be distracted by her own visions and by passing visitors. So it was sort of a role model. So sort of to wrap up, that really Clancy, to go back to Corner's criticisms, Clancy does discuss women and use women as examples for bigger points about literacy more than any other group. Again, this is only upper class women. I think that it's disingenuous to say he doesn't have time to change his approach, because he uses women as examples when discussing some of the most important parts of the book, and was able to add the chapter about Anglo-Saxon literacy. And just to end, that when we're talking about literacy in the Middle Ages, what Clancy really argues is that we're talking about a literate mentality, which is a cluster of attitudes taking place in the imaginations and assumptions of numerous individuals, and that women were vital in helping develop those attitudes by reading to their children and preparing them for the future. And just as a caveat, that this is just one small aspect of this book that I found really compelling, but this is a very complex book with a lot of contextual information needed to understand it. And so what I've tried to do here is to just sort of pull out a way of talking about the book that doesn't require quite so much contextual discussion, because it is rather deep. So thank you for listening.